Rachel. I'm Charlotte. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. I saw on Zoom, but she never replied.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As we are in the Einstein room, I think I will start with a quote from him, which says, "Time and space are not conditions of existence. Time and space is a model for thinking." Although Einstein was not obviously thinking about urban planning, time, space, and thinking are words that are very well fitted in our session today. Over the last 25 years, cities globally have grown in size and sprawn over, and also, of course, the inefficient use of land remains a problem with varying impacts on different contexts. Space is finite, thus there is a growing need to optimize the use of available space. In new neighborhoods, of course, the challenge is a bit lower because you can solve that with the planning. However, this is much more challenging in historic consolidation areas. My name is Thiago Tavares. I'm a project officer at CINEA, and I deal with the sector of integrated transport and urban mobility. And together with Andres Monzon from the Technical University of Madrid, I'm pleased to moderate this session on sharing the space and the service, new mobility patterns. Before we start, I would like to have just a brief look at one of the areas of Brussels, the Boulevard Anspach, and how it evolves in the space allocation in 100 years. So 1920, you can see from the picture that there was a big share of space. You have people, you have the trams, you have the first automobiles. When you move to the 1960s, of course, cars start taking up the space. And of course, the move of people is a bit less of the priority. And what was the decision in the 1970s to make a big construction work and move the tram lines underground. And what stayed overground was actually the cars, actually 5 lanes for the cars, and the pedestrians were a bit marginalized. If we look at the result of these, you have more cars, which also, of course, it results and more traffic. And in 2015, there was a decision to make a huge change and actually bring this area to pedestrianized area. So as you see now, of course, there is still a share of space and the fight for space. And this fight of space is based, of course, electric bikes, also the e-bikes, the quick scooters, and of course, pedestrians. Similarly, many cities are facing challenges, and of course, on how to allocate the space and accommodate the different needs of the different transport modes, but also greeneries and so on. And the fight for space is likely to continue in the urban and also suburban areas. The European Commission has funded research under Horizon 2020 to deal with these challenges. And further research will continue on the Horizon Europe calls and also under the city's mission related calls. As you know, the Commission has been put a lot of effort for achieving the 100 climate neutral cities and by 2030. And of course, urban mobility is a key aspect and sharing the space is a key aspect. Today, we're going to talk about 5 research projects. And thanks to these research projects, city authorities and urban transport planners, they are much better equipped with tools to deal with these common challenges. You see from the 5 projects, we have some dealing with the policy area, so we have spectrum and harmony on the higher level from the policy vision, and also how to make transport planning and modeling. You also look into more, which is looking more into the cities themselves and how they can share the space and also develop tools for those. You have Sunrise, which looks a little bit more outside in the suburban areas, and also Handshake, which is really strong focus on cycling. So without further ado, we're gonna start and also invite our first speaker, which is we're gonna talk about the project Sunrise. And Ralph Brand holds a PhD in community and regional planning from the University of Austin. After a decade in academia, he decided to apply his expertise in sustainable urbanism through the hands-on support to cities across Europe. The base for his work is RoopTrack Consult, where he leads the team People-Focused Mobility Solutions. He developed and managed a range of projects at the nexus of sustainable mobility, urban design, governance, planning, participation, co-creation, inclusiveness, and always from the social technical angle. So please welcome Ralph to the floor.
Thank you, Tiago, for the kind introduction. My name is Ralph Brandt. I hope the technology works. Yes. I represent the Sunrise project. I work for RoopTrack Consult in Cologne, Germany. We were the coordinators of this Horizon 2020 project. You see some quick facts, duration, amount of funding, and most importantly, our 6 action cities. And in each of these cities, one action neighborhood worked in the Sunrise project. So it's the neighborhood focus as one of the 2 key principles that we followed. One was co-creation as a procedural component, and the other, the neighborhood as a geographical unit. We understand co-creation quite broadly, comprehensively, covering the whole phases of the innovation chain, as we call it, from co-identifying jointly citizens, stakeholders, city administration, identifying the problems, all the way to co-evaluating the impacts. And these phases were represented in the work package structure, as you can see here from the PER chart. Neighborhood, we mostly defined as experiential unit, and a sociological or emotional unit, the place where everyday life unfolds. You see the range of sizes in terms of geographical size, inhabitants. Some of our neighborhoods were congruent with administrative boundaries, others weren't. It was really the experienced definition of neighborhood in our case. In all the neighborhoods, they followed a very similar or comparable path. It started with the formation of a core group consisting of local stakeholders, citizens, representatives of the administration. They exchanged a memorandum of understanding. And then the first action phase started by co-identifying where is the problem in your neighborhood in a participatory way through some online, offline techniques. And that was articulated in a neighborhood mobility dossier. So everyone in the neighborhood had the same level of information. This then led to a joint development, a search process for what kind of solution would be suitable for our specific problems. That resulted in a neighborhood mobility action plan, again, widely published, disseminated locally. The WWRNS stands for working with residents and stakeholders, so throughout all the phases, to define evaluation and impact assessment procedures, defining locally specific indicators, for example. And wherever possible, it was also the aspiration to co-implement the measures. What that means could be something like that. Citizens helping build a so-called conversation bench in Jerusalem, or citizens helping to draw public attention to an inauguration of a car-free space in Budapest, or in Bremen, local retailers agreeing to serve as hosts for a new local cargo bike sharing scheme. I would like to give you some measure highlights from all the 6 action neighborhoods. Because of time constraints, it can be only highly selective and almost anecdotal. What I want to, you can read some of that, but I want to specifically draw your attention to the red bits. I think was really impressive in Southend, very credible co-creation participatory approach managed to convince the jury of a national funding scheme to add 4 million extra leverage national funding, which I think says a lot about the credibility of this process. In Bremen, parking emerged as the most pressing issue, very wicked issue. Co-creation didn't magically make the problem go away, of course, but the issue at least was, it mobilized a public discourse. It made the public discourse, this tricky discourse, accessible to a democratic public exchange, and it manifested in the coalition agreement of a new local government that was formed a year or so after the Sunrise project started, and it led to a citywide systematic rollout of more ambitious, more progressive parking policies. I'm jumping to the bottom. In Jerusalem, walkability was the key term, the key principle there, and they developed a walkability model, which is now spreading throughout the entire city of Jerusalem, starting in our action neighborhood, and conversations are actually going on to spread it nationwide across all of Israel. So I think that's really impressive, something we're proud of it. I want to spend the rest of the time about kind of reflecting what are the key lessons, the messages that we bring from this over 4-year project. And I structure this along these 4 categories, thinking about what did we learn from learning at this unique level, geographical level at the neighborhood. Clearly there are positive things to be said, even it may be banal. The proximity, the geographical proximity is conducive to active travel, and that can be used and should be used. The neighborhood is the natural realm of children and older people, which are often overlooked in conventional mobility planning schemes. People possess very detailed knowledge about very detailed issues, something that should and can be used. And hard to reach people, or people in general, are just easier to reach and to engage in a dialogue than on a citywide level. Obviously, the neighborhood has an inherent drawback problem because the big levers, the big screws, they are not turned at the neighborhood level. They are operated at the citywide level, which we think makes it absolutely crucial to achieve a complementarity between the neighborhood work, the work in the neighborhoods, and the citywide work. And we wrote an SUMP topic guide about exactly this challenge and how this can be mastered. Some reflections about the co-creation process. Again, very important positive insights, I think. Working intensively with people makes it possible to access this local knowledge and to use what you may call crowd creativity. It creates a sense of ownership for the measures, for the local measures. And then saving resources, I graded out a little bit because there was among the initial hopes and kind of an expectation in the proposal, by utilizing the labor and the energy of citizens, maybe actually cities can save some resources. We noticed that to some degree, but actually we also noticed that a lot of the actual implementation work has to do with diggers and construction works and so forth. It remains in the realm and the responsibility and the remit of the city, and therefore the budget of the city. Something you have to acknowledge, what makes co-creation challenging and difficult: you can't hurry participation. People donate their spare time, and you can't just expect them to attend 3 meetings a week in the evening while they are supposed to bring their kids to bed. So that's something, it just needs time. And if you take co-creation seriously, then that means it's inevitably unpredictable. If you start a process and you, by identifying what is the problem, obviously you don't know what happens, what people tell you, what measures turn out to be most suitable and most important. So that requires flexibility on the side of everyone, including the funding organizations. In some cases, there is a bit of what might be called participation fatigue, especially in cases where people have been consulted previously without any tangible results following on from that. So we think we managed to avoid or overcome participation fatigue through certain innovative participation techniques, but also by being very explicit and saying, we'll give you a participation promise. Would you tell us we are serious about trying to implement this? Obviously, no blue sky promises, but we are serious and we have some budget. I think that was important. And actually, about the co-creation process, I brought some brochures and I don't want to take them back home, so please take them. Big messages. I think it's a brilliant example of cross-project collaboration. There were sister projects, so to speak, other projects focusing on the neighborhood level, and we worked with them together and tried to extract and compile all the insights that the 4 projects together collected. Some thoughts about effects, maybe also side effects. What we were hoping, but we were positively surprised about the degree of the local trust that grew in our action neighborhoods. That was really a pleasure to see. The local trust, social cohesion, fabulous result, I would say. Rethinking institutional structures, suddenly maybe departments of the city administrations who don't traditionally talk to each other had to talk to each other, the parks department, the social department, and the traffic department. And it kind of, I think it realized, it made city administrations realize that they need to think less in silos, and some have even begun to restructure their working routines. I think it's fair to say that the legitimacy of the measures had a higher level of democratic legitimacy. A problem we couldn't solve, and I think no one can solve, is the challenge of conducting conventional impact assessments for a number of reasons. Kind of the usual KPIs, the idea of even using the same KPIs across the 6 neighborhoods, that didn't really work for good reasons, which I'm happy to elaborate later on when you catch me in the corridors. Lastly, about the nature of the measures, the kind of innovations, I think it's important to say that innovation is relative to a specific local context. So introducing, I don't know, speed reduction, for example, is not new globally, universally, but in certain locations that was seen as absolutely novel and amazingly new. Sometimes it's unspectacular, so we didn't produce any patents, no smart app or something. But it's what matters to people in their everyday life. There is what I call the unyieldingness of the analog and the corporeal. We have a body, we don't like to stand in the rain, we don't like noise, and so forth. So that's something you cannot digitize away. There is a limit to this hope in digitizing everything. And I think what we experienced at the neighborhood level, what matters is that the color of the zebra crossing is not fainted. That was literally something that we heard, and that matters to people. I think it's important to differentiate between measures that only have winners, improving, embellishing, greening a space. I think hardly any people will have anything against that. But there are issues where you automatically have winners and losers, and that specifically addresses the issue of our session, space. Space is limited. If you rededicate it, you will have losers and winners and losers. And co-creation won't make this challenge go away. Special emphasis on that again, spatial justice. It remains a struggle and requires social and political choices. Critical solutions often consist not necessarily of adding a new service, a new technology, but it consists of avoiding certain problems, like reducing speed. It's not a new technology, it's not a novelty, it just does away with the problem. And that's something we encountered a lot. Last slide, I was asked to think about impacts of the long-term impacts of the project. Future research needs, I think, yes, indeed, we came across something. The first sub-bullet point there, how can state-of-the-art inspire co-creative processes? We had a little bit the experience that a bit more input about what is doable elsewhere in terms of technology or policy, whatever, could have led to more, call it sexy or whatever, solutions. So maybe there's a way to balance co-creation by using only local ideas with injecting some external ideas and inspiration. And the issue about how can funders be motivated to support non-commercializable but highly effective solutions. We cannot report about any market update because we didn't produce technologies, products. But I hope, and we're proud, and we're already seeing that experience, inspiration, guidance that is being picked up. Clearly, we contribute to the Green Deal and other high-level policy goals, I think, particularly to the active shared mobility and the space discourse. The consortium has plans about follow-up projects. We're still keen to spread our insights. And the last point, how can other projects benefit? Yeah, of course, our guidelines, tools. We have an e-course, and hopefully we inspire and motivate other people to follow similar processes. I think that's it. How much time has been gained? Not applicable in our case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hal, for this very inspiring presentation. Some takeaways that I have is that, of course, the neighborhoods might have different issues that cities have. So, and the co-creative approach can be also used to solve these issues. Another interesting point was about avoiding this participation fatigue. So to make sure that if you do engage with the citizens, you actually are ready to solve the problems. And finally, I think it's also very interesting, you know, we are talking about research and innovation, and sometimes you always expect the solutions are very, I don't know, groundbreaking, but sometimes the solution that you need are actually not that spectacular. So let's keep that in mind and then let's try to focus on solving the problems. And now I would like to invite our next presenter that will talk about Handshake. And this is Giorgia Galvini. She joined EasyNova in 2019, managing different EU and research innovation projects in the policy support analysis in the field of mobility, energy, food systems, and sustainable transition. She previously worked as a project manager and fundraising for different projects at national, European, and international context, in particular the ECGC from the Italian Agency for Development Cooperation, the EU Solidarity Corps, Life Plus, and the Smart City Mission from the Government of India. She holds a degree in Development and International Cooperation from the University of Bologna and has carried out research about the environment footprint of product and organization through a consumption-based input-output analysis at the Sustainable Research Institute of Leeds. Welcome, Giorgia.
Okay, as has been introduced, I am a research and project manager at EasyNova, which is based in Rome and is coordinating the Civitas project called Handshake. The project is carried out by 19 organizations and due to an extension of 6 months due to COVID restriction, it will last until August 2022. 13 cities from all corners of Europe came together to share and inspire cycling innovation, split into 3 mentoring groups, which is Copenhagen, then is mentoring Helsinki, Manchester, and Riga. Munich with Cadiz and Krakow, and Amsterdam is mentoring Bordeaux, Bruges, Dublin, Turin, and Rome. Since only few cities have already developed an holistic approach to cycling, while many cities, as our future cycling capital, have partial knowledge in some area of cycling, but innovation has not always reached the cities who will stand to gain the most from it. Under Handshake, cycling knowledge, expertise, and a long list of technical measures are shared through an interwoven transfer process that accelerates urban change and pushes cycling innovation further. The transfer process is composed on a comprehensive evaluation and monitoring framework to analyze the cost-benefit analysis of our cycling solution. We have the mentoring program for all our 13 cities and immersive study tour and symposium. Then we'll have to transfer the knowledge and the expert team from our cycling capitals to the other cities. So what we have done in these years with knowledge transfer, capacity building, relation brokerage, and inspiration support by 35 projects and teams active on our Handshake Exchange Hub, 3 too many mentoring programs, and 8 immersive experience, then NSA are 3 to 5 day mission involving inclusive cities delegation. We have done dozens of webinar, Q&A session, co-planning meetings, planning context, a novel self-assessment online tool to obtain support and sense of direction in cycling policies. We are developing a 16 cycling solution that can be classified in 4 thematic, which are planning, regulation and standard, infrastructure and service, modeling and assessment, and awareness and education activities. In terms of outreach, we released 66 news on achievement, events, analysis, 38 events internal to the project and external to other partner organizations, online and on-site on our cities. 6th edition of the Cycling Scoop, which is our newsletter. 70 key resources with headline project report alongside crucial insight about our cities and general good practice in the world of cycling. We are cooperating with key European cycling players and dozens of interaction with international cycling organizations in USA, Australia, and Asia. Finally, in terms of impact, we collect evidence from cycling solution that will be reported in our postponed assessment in August 2022. Key result preview to be unveiled at Velocity 2022, where Handshake will give multiple presentations. An early analysis suggests that our city have substantially expanded their cycling infrastructure and facility, with an estimation growth ranging from plus 10% to 50% of cycling supply. Cycling demand is also growing on starting rates, with specific on-site measurement showing up plus 275% of growth. And as well, COVID-19 has certainly been a major enabler and accelerator of pro-cycling urban policy. We have also analyzed the effect of COVID in cycling growth in our city separately from other project activity. At least we try to collect data and information of that. Here, for example, you can see how one of the main roads of Turin has been transformed thanks to a Dutch-inspired design, and how the cycling increase in these roads. So what we expect in terms of mid to long-term impact. To enhance integration of cycling planning in urban planning with its synergy with spatial planning. The flourishing of a transnational planning culture whereby teams work in close cooperation with teams of other cities. There will be colleagues in the office and colleagues abroad. This is a trend that we are observing is going to last also behind Handshake. The launch of the Cycling Community of Practice, which is a city-driven spillover project founded by private and public donors that will sustain the main service fronted by Handshake behind the project timeline and European boundaries. In terms of future research need, so we identify a lack of standardized KPI system for cycling and a lack of comparable data at all levels. Research should focus on how to expand and standardize data collection method on cycling and integrate current Eurostat database to include cycling KPIs such as bicycle kilometer traveled. Monitor and evaluation practice are uncommon for cycling project in most of our cities, especially ex post evaluation. The number of before and after cases are limited to inform and support policies. Tools such as cost-benefit analysis could greatly benefit from improved modeling techniques and more research into specific effects of active mobility, such as health benefit, quality of public space, value of real estate, and business revenue. More behavioral research should support to assess cultural resistance to change in citizens as in policies and in business. The bold and urgent decision required by the climate emergency can hardly afford the decades any cultural transformation required. Our first insight of health effects that had been revealed very important in these years of COVID, of course, show that the economic benefit of active mobility are very high. But these are often underexposed in traditional transport evaluation, as there are no standard figures at the EU level and on handbooks. So more effort should be made to integrate transport cost-benefit analysis handbooks with health effects. And finally, on what are our contribution to the Green Deal, smart and sustainable mobility strategy and city mission. The project, of course, directly contributes to climate change mitigation by favoring a modal shift from motorized transportation to active mobility. The direct contribution are also relevant in terms of body knowledge created across municipalities, transfer of technical know-how from more advanced cities to less advanced ones, increased visibility and political support for pro-cycling projects, and awareness raising and engagement of senior political and technical staff. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Giorgio, for this very inspiring presentation. I think it's also interesting for the key points that I took is that, of course, knowledge transfer, it's an important element because you have so many leading cities on cycling. And when you share that with cities that do not have this taken up so high, there is a huge impact. I mean, I think what you mentioned as a 10% to 50% additional infrastructure shows that the commitment of the cities to really improve the cycling. And also there's a result of a plus 275% of cycling. Of course, COVID has an impact, but for sure the sharing of space and the allocation of space for this is very important. And then we also take note, of course, the lack of standardized KPIs and comparable data, and hope the future research can solve these issues. And also in terms of the use of CBAs and cost-benefit analysis and also can benefit for additional and better modeling techniques. So of course we have some projects also dealing with modeling today, such as Harmony, so maybe they can also cover some aspects related to it. Now as our next project, we're going to talk about Sprout. And we are pleased to have here Dr. Teresa de la Cruz. She's a project manager at the Research Office of Zaragoza Logistics Center. She has a PhD degree in analytical chemistry in the field of environmental atmospheric emissions from the University of Zaragoza. She also holds a master's degree in supply chain management from the Zaragoza Logistics Center. She is the project coordinator of Sprout project and has also participated in other research and development projects on national, regional, and European level. So, please, the floor is yours, Teresa.
Thank you, Tiago, for the introduction. It's a pleasure being here today presenting the Sprout project. My name is Teresa de la Cruz, and I work at the Zaragoza Logistics Center, or CLC. Well, I will provide first a framework since all our projects address the same issues, but in a different way. We all have seen how in the last 5-10 years, new business models enabled by digital technologies are like blooming in our cities, new mobility solutions. However, those solutions sometimes do not really seem to fit into the local, regional, national, or even sectorial regulations. Take, for instance, the example of the electric scooters. They have been banned from many cities worldwide. There are restrictions regarding where they can or not be used, and sometimes they create conflicts with other road users, specifically with pedestrians. But it can also be seen the other way around, that legislative and governmental issues are affecting business models implementation, and thus hindering economic opportunities in our cities. And this is the challenge that Sprout has come to address. Sprout stands for Sustainable Policy Response to Urban Mobility Transition. It was supposed to finish by August this year, but due to the impact of the COVID in the implementation, we are in the process of requesting an extension of 6 months. So the project has not finished already. It's coordinated by CLC with the close support of CERT as technical coordinators, and also other well-known and recognized universities and research institutes that provide support to our cities and municipalities that are the core of the Sprout project. Sprout has two main objectives. On the one hand, to provide a city-led innovative policy response, which is capable of harnessing the impacts of the new mobility solutions, making them more attractive to the users and more sustainable for the society as a whole. And the other big objective is to produce practice-based knowledge and tools to navigate the policy through the transition and use this to contribute to an evidence-based policy making. And in order to achieve those big goals, we have 5 sub-objectives. First, understand the transition in urban mobility and being able to quantify it. Identify which are the drivers of change and foresee their impacts. Formulate this city-led policy response that I have mentioned, and this is what we are finalizing now in the project, and then capacity building. Provide tools to enhance local policy-making capacity and guidance, navigate future policy on urban mobility. In order to achieve the objectives, in Sprout we follow an approach of 3 layers of cities. It's more or less like in an onion. We have first layer cities that have actually implemented new mobility solutions and have derived policy responses for harnessing the impacts of those solutions. Then we have second layer cities that are currently carrying out transferability analysis and are enriching those policies. And then we have a third layer of cities that follow the project very closely and support us mainly through participation in webinars and surveys, and will help us in order to make the Sprout policy response more widely applicable to the whole European context. And this is something that I would like to highlight regarding the project, that Sprout has a pool of 40 cities cooperating towards a more appropriate way of policy making for the urban mobility transition. Now, in order to link the project results so far with the foreseen impacts of the working program, the first impact is new knowledge production. And in this regard, in Sprout, we have produced a full urban mobility transition inventory with the KPIs that are needed to be considered, which are the drivers of change and their impacts, and the stakeholders that are affected or might be affected by the transition. Another output in this regard is the Sprout evaluation framework. It's supposed to be used in order to speed up the policy's definition when a city wants to introduce a new mobility solution. It's a combination of well-known and proved Civitas methodologies, also with original content. It has been presented in the framework with the colleagues of the Civitas Elevate evaluation group, has been applied in the project pilot cities, and we have also presented it in different conferences. I submitted a couple of papers to scientific journals. Another impact foreseen in the working program is evidence-based policy making. And in this regard, Sprout has co-created different future urban mobility scenarios. Future mobility scenarios are based on a sound methodology that takes into account the current policies that are in place in the cities, the drivers of change and their impacts, and the stakeholders environment. The future mobility scenarios allow us to understand how likely urban mobility is going to evolve in the future, in our case, by 2030, and to understand the impacts of this evolution if the current policies that are in place remain unchanged. So it will be what will happen if we do nothing. This will be like the summary of this exercise. We have found that these future scenarios are a very powerful tool in order to set a systemic participatory approach in the cities, and a very good way of understanding which is the impact of policy making. This is the example of the city of Padua, the three most plausible scenarios for 2030. We have co-created 3 scenarios per pilot city. Then, continuing with the evidence-based policymaking impact, we have implemented 9 use cases in 5 pilot cities. I cannot enter into detail on the different use cases, but they cover a wide range of targets. They cover the target passengers, also vulnerable road users, freight, and the combination, which is known as cargo hitching, freight and passengers. And the pilots are selected as well in a way that they cover different levels of innovation and different levels of disruptiveness. The cities follow the evaluation framework that I have mentioned before in order to assess the operational feasibility of the mobility solutions, the financial feasibility, and also the sustainability impact, and as well other indicators that were strategic at city level, that are the ones in the slide. But when we implemented the new mobility solutions, well, we found different challenges and different barriers, let's say, that evidence that the current way of that the cities are making policy making is not the adequate. In general, we found that the administrative processes were too long, especially when they involve different departments. We found as well some issues regarding the data provision, regarding the agreements on data sharing between the private operators and the public administrations. In some cases, it was very difficult to establish the baselines for the pilot since there was not data available to do this. And in particular, for the most disruptive and the most technological pilots, we found that administration doesn't go on the same pace, and there is a need for an innovative public procurement scheme. With this input and also by applying the evaluation framework, the cities found different policy measures that could support the implementation of those new mobility solutions. This is the example of the city of Valencia. In Valencia, they created parkings for private bicycles at metro stations and also parcel lockers at metro stations through a public-private cooperation scheme. And well, now what we are doing in the project is that we have linked the different second layer cities to the 9 use cases depending on their interest. The second layer cities have set local innovation forums, and they are working in the transferability and enrichment of the policy measures. Then we are working in parallel in a system dynamics model in order to make policy modeling, and afterwards policy packaging in order to create this sprout policy response, so any city in Europe at different levels in the cycle of policy making can take it as a reference and answering to the questions of better understanding, better regulation, and better financing. In the coming months, we will have also very interesting outputs or results. We are working in an innovation readiness index, so the cities is an auto-assessment tool, so they can evaluate the level of readiness towards innovative policy making. The system dynamics model that I have mentioned, in order to understand the relation between different urban mobility elements, which will be the potential effect of introducing a new policy measure. A shared data space populated with data from the cities, an early alert and action tracking, so the cities can be monitoring the status of their urban mobility, and they can identify when there is an early signal of change, and this way review their policies and anticipate future transitions. And finally, a toolbox. Now, regarding the expected impact at midterm and long term, this is pretty straightforward in the case of Sprout. First, related to harness, ensure the positive mobility impacts at the level of the individual Sprout cities. And afterwards, not only for the Sprout cities, but for any city that wants to access to Sprout results, enhance cities' capacity in polling design and decision-making processes. And finally, in order to conclude, regarding the long-term navigation and providing guidance, revision of the SAM guidelines, probably we will do this also in cooperation with other projects that also address this issue, urban agenda policy briefs, and a European strategy to navigate urban mobility through this transition, and an international cooperation agenda with the States, Europe, and China. And well, all those impacts, expected impacts, are very related with the European Green Deal and the Europe Fit for the Digital Age. And that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for presenting to us what you have done in Sprout. And I think some takeaways that I take here is, of course, the legislative and governmental issues that can also impact, of course, the implementation of new mobility solutions. But that actually, if you have this knowledge and the tools that have been created by Sprout, this can actually help cities to solve those. So, of course, I would encourage you to look at Sprout and see which tools they have developed and try to take advantage of those. Also, 40 cities cooperating is not something that is very easy to find. So, I mean, it also shows that the issue is a very important one. And we also heard again the word co-participatory approach. And in this case, it's actually not only for solving a problem, but actually in a vision for the future. So I think we should always keep that in mind. And finally, again, Sprout has really supported a lot of new tools for guiding the transition for sustainable mobility, and also can impact, of course, the achievement of the goals of the EU Green Deal. So indeed, I mean, we are looking forward for the next steps as well in the finalization of the project. Now we're going to move to the next project, which is MORE. And here we have two presenters, two speakers. First is Dr. Charlotte Halpern. Is a tenure researcher in political science at Science Pro Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics in Paris. Her work focuses on the governance and policy dimensions of sustainable transport transitions in European cities. And also we have Peter Jones, Professor of Transport and Sustainable Development at UCL for Transport Studies. He's a member of the UK Independent Transport Commission, the DFT's Science Advisory Council, and co-chair of its Joint Analysis Development Panel. He is also the scientific coordinator for MORE, improving the design and operation of the road spacing on urban main roads through new processes and tools. And he was also the advisory board of the EU SUMMI Indicator Project and advised the European Commission and a number of major cities, state and national governments around the world. So please welcome Peter and Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Tiago, and I'd like to acknowledge your support you've given us as our project officer, which has been very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. I think I'm just about to say good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to do the main presentation because of time, and then Charlotte's going to answer the difficult questions. I think that's the arrangement. So basically, MORE stands for Multimodal Optimization of Road Space in Europe. It's a 3.5-year Horizon 2020 project with a budget of about 5.5 million euro. And you can see there we've got 4 groups of partners. In yellow, we have 3 universities, represented myself, UCL, Charlotte Sciences Po, also Dresden. We then have a series of private sector companies that mainly have worked on the tools that I'll describe later on. We then have a series of organisations, including Polis, UITP and others, who represent particular road user groups that we wanted to be involved in the project. And then we have 5 cities representing different urban nodes on the Trans-European network. And you can see from the map there the spread of those cities across Europe. So essentially, the key objectives of the project, what we did was to review existing guides, regulations to do with the use of urban road space and to identify future challenges. The idea then was to develop guidelines for the comprehensive reallocation of space on main roads and streets, in particular the busier radials that connect the city centres to the Trans-European road network. To produce and test a comprehensive process for redesign of busy urban streets, right through from how we identify in a co-creation way with citizens problems through to final scheme selection. And as part of that process, to develop and test a set of tools to support street redesign, starting off with option generation, going on to co-creating street designs, then to do advanced simulation to see how they would play out in reality, and finally appraisal of design options. This is the structure of the project. The 4 colours give you the 4 different segments, really. The first part of the project was investigation and review, and we had 3 parallel processes then. One was looking at the state of the art in terms of what guides are already out there on road user needs and street design, what policies are there, what indicators are available to measure success and performance. Secondly, the one that Charlotte led on, about political, institutional, organisational and regulatory aspects. These are the things that actually limit what's possible, both politically and also legally. And then thirdly, we looked at future scenarios, the development of technologies, how might patterns of demand evolve in the future, and so on. So that was the first block of work. And then from that, we moved down to the development of the design tools. I'll explain more about that in a few minutes. And then working with our 5 cities, we applied those design tools on particular tricky parts of these radial routes we call the stress sections in each of the 5 cities. And then as a result of that, we've developed a MORE toolkit, we've called it a handbook now in fact, and have refined the various tools that we work with during the project, so they're now available for other cities to use. So key findings. What we found, despite an extensive international research, is that there's no comprehensive design guides at the moment that cover all street users together. Look at the whole street, building line to building line. Most of the guides, and there are some very good ones, are modally based, looking at cycling, for example. and very few of them look at street activities. In other words, the streets we know and love are the ones where people go and actually meet people, chat, window shop, eat in the street, whatever. Very little on that, how to actually support that. The key thing underlying that is the recognition that within urban areas, our main streets, or most of our streets, have an important movement function. We know that, both for vehicles and people, but also an important place function, where streets are destinations that people come to spend time, spend money, and so on, and form part of a complex ecosystem that has lots of interactions. Thirdly, as Tiago's already mentioned, that street space is a scarce resource, and so we need to manage it intelligently and to get the most out of it, recognizing that patterns of demand vary from time to time, to do it more dynamically. Fourthly, we also became aware that most urban design policies actually have a street component, whether it's your policy about economic development or health or environment, whatever. Most of the policies actually play out on the streets. That's where people see the practical impact of policies, and that's where the conflicts potentially arise. And finally, appropriate governance structures and regulation are key to successful planning and implementation. This is an overview of the street design process that we've recommended, and then on the side there you'll see the particular tools that contribute to those different sections, and I'll say more stages. I'll say more about that. So essentially, first of all, we start by selecting the study area and measure its existing characteristics. Then, through engagement with a wide range of stakeholders, we identify the issues that need to be addressed by a street redesign, and from that we then prepare a design brief, setting out the objectives and also the current and projected future requirements. Then we generate design options, and then we develop designs, then we assess and appraise them, and then we can refine them, and if through that process we think we have something suitable, we can go through to decision and implementation. If not, we can go back around part of that loop again, look for other solutions and so on. So just quickly to take you through the tools that we've developed. Some are new tools, some are extensions of existing tools. The first two are new tools developed by a colleague of mine, Paulo Enceas at UCL. The first was, there's lots of information out there about things, street design elements that you can introduce, but they're not really brought together. So he's produced a digital library, if you like, where you can interrogate it based on particular objectives you want to achieve or meeting the needs of particular user groups. And he's put together information on 210 different design elements in the street, telling you something about, here for example, what it actually is, how it's been used, how it might help to meet different policies, and how it helps or restricts the ability to meet the needs of different user groups. The second tool he developed is looking cross-sectionally and saying, okay, having identified what are the main groups we're trying to design for, whether it's having priority for trams, cycles, wide footways for street activities, whatever, let's be more imaginative and look at different ways that you might lay out that street in cross-section. So 99% of the time, cycle lanes are next to the curb, and then there are problems about buses pulling over and cycles having to avoid cars parking and doors opening. Maybe in some cases you could put the cycle lanes in the middle of the road, and they, in many ways, would be safer. There wouldn't be a curb interaction there. So just get people to think a bit more openly about what might the possibilities be. So those are the two option generation tools. Then we did a lot of work on stakeholder engagement, increasingly obviously online because of the effects of COVID. So one of our partners developed Buchanan Computing, adapted and modified a tool they already had developed so that very easily people online could actually pinpoint particular areas in the streets where they felt there were particular problems. They could identify the problem both from a list and also in free format, and we asked for some information about the person, their trip purpose, their modes, and so on. So we could pull that all together and very easily, using dashboards, see where are the problems, who's experienced them, and what needs to be tackled. The other thing, we'd moved on to stakeholder engagement. Some of that was done online, but how we find it worked best actually was to work together in physical groups with physical tools in a way. So we have plans at 1 to 200 scale of streets, and then you can see on the right hand side there's a box of different blocks. Each of those blocks are at 1 to 200 scale, and they represent parking bays, loading bays, bus stops, things like that. And we also had acetates that were more flexible and could be used to mark out cycle lanes, bus lanes, wider footways, and so on. And through this process, it gave people ideas about things that they might want to introduce on the street. Oh, we must make sure we put benches in, or cycle parking or something. But also, because it was all to scale, people themselves could see, well, if we want to have a cycle lane there and we want a bus lane, then we haven't got enough room for parking there, and things like that. So it was very interactive and really worked very well. And then, having come up with some design options, the question then is to actually simulate how those designs would work if they were introduced. And here we work with PTV that have well-known software called Vism, but they developed that software further to look in a more sophisticated way at activities on the street, people queuing, waiting for vehicles, in this case trams, or people just stopping and chatting, or sitting at benches and so on. So we get a more complete picture of how streets would look under these different design options. And then my colleague again, Paolo Enseas, developed an Excel spreadsheet tool where you could appraise the different design options under 3 sets of criteria. One is in terms of the extent to which they met political priorities. One going a bit further, and if the data was there, using cost-benefit analysis, as we heard just now for cycling, and possibility of going to another stage and doing a comprehensive multi-criteria analysis where you weigh up the interests of different user groups and see to what extent the design meets their needs. So, mid to long-term expected impact. What we expect is that the cities have received this process and the tools very well, so we think that more and more cities, we hope, will be able to take advantage of this process, adapting it to their local needs. In cases where you have busy streets, where you have many competing demands, and really the solution lies in co-creation and co-development. We think in these more complicated situations, stakeholder co-design will become common as a means of developing better designs and getting a wider acceptance of change. What we find is if people are engaged, even if they don't get everything they want at the end, they recognise that compromises are necessary and their voice has been heard, and it's possible to reduce a high proportion of the discontent that arises if you simply produce a design and ask people to approve it. We think and we believe that the tools we've developed will be very helpful to cities and widely used throughout Europe. And we hope that the findings, our much broader findings, will encourage and assist cities in moving towards a more dynamic allocation of street space, supported by the growing number of sensors on the streets, so we can actually see how streets are being used in real time, and LED street signs and road markings, as well as obviously in-vehicle information. In terms of gaps and policy implications, one of the things that we found that was a real problem for us, there is almost a complete lack of data anywhere in the world on pedestrian flows and street activities. By which I mean, if we improve a design, if we widen footways, make better public realm, how many more pedestrians will it attract? How much more time will they spend there? And in our designs, we try to do that in a number of places. In Lisbon, for example, by closing one side of a large roundabout with a small park in the middle to open up the park to the local community. We know exactly what the delay effects would be on the vehicles, but we don't know how many more people would come there, how much more time they would spend there, and how to value that time. Linked to that, we lack a means of valuing benefits of street improvements, so that, as I say, we know the congestion delays, but if a lot more people can come and meet friends in their community and spend time there, what's the real value of that to society and the economy? And we think also the working more will assist in lining the 10T and urban node objectives to give better door-to-door experiences. At the moment, there's often a disconnect. Cities are trying to reduce traffic levels. On the 10T network, the companies and organisations operating that are still planning for traffic growth. And obviously, those things are not compatible. And we think, finally there, that urban street design will have a major role to play in helping to deliver wider policy objectives relating to public health, livability, zero carbon, etc. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And we know that Charlotte is ready for the questions that will come later on. Now, I wanted to highlight a few points from the MOA project. And of course, they took a very challenging task to review existing guides and regulations for street design. But of course, these are essential because they define what can be done. And also, what was very interesting that they really focus on tools that cover the entire spectrum, from the high level and macro planning into looking into the cross-section design. And also, which allows the planners to use imagination and really think of different options, because it's very easy to use the tools. And finally, I wanted to highlight in terms of the stakeholder engagement that sometimes it's very difficult for people that are not used to planning imagine the size of things. So basically the hands-on approach, where you can really take a bus and you take a cycling lane and put on the street and see what's the impact, can actually help citizens to think on what solutions can be implemented considering the constraints that are there. So now I'd like to go for the final presentation of the project Harmony. And to present, I would like to invite Lampros Ifantis. He has a Master of Engineering and Master of Science in Transport Engineering and System Management. His PhD focused on simulation-based evaluation of mobility as a service, systems, and the design of optimal multimodal travel recommendations. He has been working as a research fellow at UCL, Mass Lab for 3 years, and currently working as scientific researcher in IMSUM. As a researcher, Lampros has been responsible for contributing to managing and coordinating several projects, Horizon 2020, and also looking into business, design, and planning dimensions for urban regional mobility, traffic management, and also looking at new mobility concepts. So please welcome Lampros.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Thiago. Thank you also to the other speakers. Just a question from my side. How do we change the slides? Sorry, it's the green button. Lovely. My name is Lampros Ifantis. I'm a scientific researcher at AIMSON, and I'm going to present activities and findings from the Harmony project. I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. The Harmony is an about 7.5 million euro project where we have 21 partners from 9 different European countries, including academic institutions, consultancies, technology providers, and metropolitan authorities, including Oxfordshire, the metropolitan area of Turin, the metropolitan area of Athens, GZM metropolis in Poland, a small municipality, Trikala in Greece, and Rotterdam. A few information about the project. The vision of the project is to develop a new generation of harmonized spatial and transport planning tools by modeling the changing dynamics in transport and spatial organization and enabling metropolitan area authorities to lead the transition to a low carbon new mobility era in a more sustainable manner. So the Harmony project has several activities, a lot of activities actually, which are divided into 6 different axes. In axis 1 aims into identifying new mobility concepts, new mobility technologies and services, while also identifying perceptions from stakeholders towards those services. Axis 2 is responsible for the co-creation labs and the managing of the pilots, including different demonstrations of autonomous vehicles and drones, as well as the application of different data collection techniques from stakeholders and citizens. Axis 3 is responsible and aims at developing new solutions for integrating, storing, and managing data, multidisciplinary data for different types of transport solutions. Axis 4, which is the main component of the project itself, is responsible for developing a software agnostic next generation spatial and transport planning modeling suite, which I will refer later on more specifically, on applying this particular modeling suite, this particular platform in the different pilots of the project, and also investigating linkages of the platform itself with more aggregate European union-wide models like TriMod. And Axis 5 is responsible for creating recommendations for updating sustainable urban mobility plans, while Axis 6 is responsible for scaling up and disseminating the results of the project itself. So in general, the main outcomes of the project are the Harmony Model Suite, a piece of software, along with their insights with regards to the evaluations of different use cases for spatial and transport planning in the metropolitan areas that I've mentioned before, training material and activities for using the Harmony Model Suite, the Harmony MS, as I will refer, both in Europe and the US, as well as recommendations for updating sustainable urban mobility plans, including recommendations for autonomous vehicles and drones. So the next part of my presentation, the main part, is with regards to certain activities and results from the project itself, including the development of modeling scenarios for the metropolitan areas, the demonstration of new technologies, and the Harmony Model Suite. Starting with the scenarios, there have been several rounds of co-creation activities in the project. We have discussed extensively, quite extensively, I would say, with planning authorities from the different metropolitan areas in order to understand the challenges, the current challenges that they have, the investments that they have in place, and the planning strategies. From that, we moved on to discussing, defining, and redefining plans for new types of interventions for land use, transportation, and infrastructure. This way, we managed to design different types of modeling use cases, including identifying data requirements for each use case for the metropolitan areas. And finally, to apply, we're in the process of applying and evaluating the use cases using the Harmony MS. This is just an indicative example of the different types of modeling use cases that we have for Rotterdam, for Oxford, Rotterdam, Turin, and Athens. There is a diversity in the use cases, but at the same time, there's a consistency with regards to the spatial and transport planning element and bringing those two elements together within one platform. So we have different types of new land uses, new spatial developments like zero emission zones for freight or restricted vehicle access zones, as well as a combination of new mobility services like mobility as a service, autonomous demand responsive travel services, and freight concepts like crowd shipping and microhubs. So everything comes together. However, the impact evaluation scope for each metropolitan area is different because we have strategic, tactical, and operational planning. Moving on to another interesting activity of the project is the demonstration of new types of technologies. We have both autonomous vehicle and drone demonstrations in the project, but the one that has already been implemented and we have some insights is the drone demonstrations in a small city in Greece, Trikala, a central city in Greece. The use case was to deliver medication from city storages to pharmacies in surrounding villages. For this purpose, we have established a living lab in the municipality with different public authorities, local public authorities, universities, sponsors, and technology providers for the drone platform. The demonstration was implemented successfully, and we have some initial insights. There is a very short video with some of the highlights from this particular demonstration. Yes, it's a very short one. Just indicating that this is the elevated platform in the city center with the drone itself. The drone transports medicine to a pharmacy in a nearby village, to another elevated platform, and then comes back to the city. This is just the concept. It's just videos for some highlights. There was a lot of interest from the citizens in this particular area for this project, for this demonstration. We are currently investigating and conducting surveys with different stakeholders, including the demonstration and citizens, in order to gain more insights. But we have some initial insights, and we realize that we definitely need, there's definitely some training requirements, so we need to develop modules that will train individuals how to safely extract the cargo, the package from a drone, and how to operate the transportation box. There are certain traffic management implications. During the demonstration, public roads were evacuated, so there had to be a rerouting of vehicles. This might actually be the case for the early implementations of drones, where drones will be allowed to fly above public roads. So traffic management operators will have an extra level of complexity where they have to manage both traffic, road traffic and air traffic at the same time by rerouting traffic accordingly. And finally, we have requirements with regards to technology. We need to develop, which is the easiest, if I may say, from these three, we need to develop applications and GPS tracker interfaces, not just for different types of stakeholders, including, for example, the pharmacists themselves, but also for individuals, for concepts where drones deliver, for example, medication to the actual recipients rather than the pharmacy. Moving on to the last activity and findings from our project is the Harmony Model Suite, which is the main output, let's say, of the project itself. What is the Harmony MS? The Harmony MS is a multi-scale software agnostic spatial and transport planning tool. It's a platform that tries to tackle a challenge of integrating different types of models from different types of planning levels within one platform, including the strategic level, the tactical, and the operational. At the strategic level, we have regional economy models, land use models, socio-demographic forecasting, population synthesis, and mobility tool ownership. Basically, choices that individuals make on a long term, from year to year or a month-to-month basis. On the tactical simulator, we have demand models for passenger and freight, which are activity-based, agent-based demand models. And at the operational level, we have traditional traffic assignment tools, which a particular focus has been given in order to extend existing tools with the ability to simulate new mobility concepts. The software architecture of the Harmony MS is basically a front end and a back end. On the front end, we have a web-based interface where end users can actually manage their own transportation scenarios, see the results from different types of simulations, and compare different types of scenarios based on concrete settings. While on the back end, we have the platform core and the platform plugins. The platform core is a piece of code that basically manages a specific workflow that the end user has defined, and the platform plugins are the components, the models, and the simulators themselves. There are certain innovative features that have driven the development of the Harmony MS. A goal from the project was to allow a flexible integration of new simulators and models within the platform, including also adapters for highly used traditional traffic assignment tools, either simulation-based or analytical approaches, like coming from companies like Aimson or PTV, and integrating them with the activity-based demand models developed within the Harmony MS during the project. Another goal was to deliver an end-user friendly platform for managing different scenarios, data, and results, but also at the same time, a platform that enables a wide variety of what-if analysis, scenario analysis. Finally, we have the goal of the platform was also to enable end users to leverage already integrated simulators and components in the platform itself, but also as easily as possible to extend the capabilities with new workflows and new templates. And finally, what I mentioned before, to extend existing traffic assignment tools with the possibility of investigating and simulating new mobility concepts. I have a video here, a demonstration with regards to the Harmony MS. I don't want to spend too much time on it. This is the login platform of the Harmony MS. This is just for demonstration purposes. If it's possible to move it a bit faster, that would be lovely. So modelers and developers, modelers and planners can use it in different ways. This is an example of a planner where it chooses a specific template from the simulator and manages the metadata, its different configurations and the input files. We can go further. So the particular template has two different components, two different simulators that are being run, which can be seen on top. These two are configured, and then back in the project page, you can see that we can run. Oh, sorry, it's okay. It's nowhere. This is the next slide. But the video was showing that there can be in parallel running simulations for different types of scenarios. For the same scenario, different experiments can be generated with different configurations, and there is a visualization dashboard where different scenarios from the same experiments from the same scenario can be compared with each other. We're in the process of actually evaluating the use cases and modeling them, but there is a particular use case for the municipality of Rotterdam, where our colleagues from TU Delft have done an amazing job. They actually received the Best Paper Award at TRB for this particular application of zero emission zones in Rotterdam. The concept for this particular use case was that there will be, the city was interested in investigating a zero-emission zone in the central part of Rotterdam, where specifically only zero-emission vehicles can enter for freight, can enter the zero-emission zone. A proportion of the shipments would be redistributed in 7 urban consolidation centers, which are distributed in the periphery, in the perimeter of the zero-emission zone, and the delivery and the collection from the urban consolidation centers into them would happen only with dedicated zero-emission vehicles, including cargo bikes. From this particular use case, we had some very interesting results where we saw that there is about an 8% reduction in total emissions within the municipality of Rotterdam, including all the freight traffic coming from and to the port area. And at the same time, we noticed that due to the rerouting of the shipments to the hubs, this has led to small increases of emissions in the surrounding area. So with regards to emissions, there is a very positive effect of this particular intervention in the city of Rotterdam. And also on the vehicle use, there was a decrease in the use of tractor and trailer combinations, while the share of new zero-emission vehicles is is expected to be almost 10% in total vehicle kilometers. Going to the last part of my presentation, I would like to refer on the potential impacts, mid and long-term impacts of the project itself from different perspectives. From a technological perspective, we have the Harmony Model Suite, which will be available in the market in mid-2023. The particular planning tool is designed to support different eco-rational policies and with a range of KPIs for different evaluation of use cases from an environmental, economic and societal standpoint. From a business perspective, 4 outputs from the project itself, including the Harmony MS, a different version of the MS, the Mobi app, and the UTM platform for Airbus will be commercialized. There will be 6 training courses which will help extending skills of practitioners and models on spatial and transport planning. And with regards to input to policy making, we will have several lessons learned from the use case evaluations for the drone and robot demonstrations in the metropolitan areas, as well as from surveys that we conducted with different stakeholders about the impact of COVID-19 on travel demand and transport operations. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Lampros, for this presentation. And I'd like to highlight 2 points. I think the first one is indeed that Harmony is looking at a very holistic approach from the strategic models, where it looks at economic growth, then looking for the tactical and also operational. So it really covers all the phases of the planning. And it's not only for passengers, but also for freight. And of course, what is also very important, that cities use different software, of course. So as you have a software agnostic model suite, this actually is very helpful. So you can use different modelings such as AMSU and PTV models. Then another interesting perspective, which is also look at a different level for the use of space, is actually looking at 3D. Right, you know the drones are coming up quite heavily, and of course there is discussion in terms of urban air mobility and how it will impact. So it's also good to have these projects that are looking on how the traditional transport modeling tools can actually be used to also simulate the impact of these new vehicles and new modes. And finally, also looking into the zero emission zones, and it was interesting to see that, of course, the focus was on the freight vehicles, and although, of course, you reduce the freight, the impact on the CO2 emissions in the cities, there was also an overall reduction from these vehicles. So I just would like to, first of all, thank all the speakers for really having very interesting presentations and actually keeping the time. I think that was impressive. Well done, guys. I'm very proud of you. And of course, now is the time for interesting questions as well. And I'd like to invite my colleague Andres Monzon for leading this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago. I think after all these 5 presentations, I would expect so many questions because the topic is very broad, and also the approaches that the 5 projects had been dealing with this topic is really different and really very innovative. So probably there are many questions or many ideas that you can raise in this question session. So please introduce yourself before posing your questions, and then we can deliver to the person that you address. Okay, I cannot see with the lights properly. Okay. No.
No. There it is.
No.
Okay, now it works. Michael Glotz-Richter, City of Thank you. Still Michael Glotz-Richter, still City of Bremen. At least I hope so. A question to Lampros, but also to the others, Ralph and Charlotte, Georgia, about something that usually we don't like to have, which is enforcement. Yeah, that we, let's say, have to have some power to really ensure that rules are kept. And This is something, some of you touched it a little bit, but I would like to know how it works with your zero emission zone enforcement. How do you check whether, for instance, hybrid vehicles are turned off or are having the engine idling? There are a lot of points. Parking is the big issue that we had in Sunrise. And Germany is a wild west in parking. Don't believe that German keeps the rule. So, yeah, all these things, and I think this is a subject that we should elaborate a little bit more, and I would like to hear a bit more than you did in the presentations, which were brilliant. Thank you for that.
Okay, Lambros.
Yes, so thanks for the question. Just to clarify, the particular application of the zero emission zone was in a simulation experiment, in a simulation environment. So we didn't have applicability and operationalization issues with regards to this. So we designed different types of scenarios, including different, let's say, configurations of a zero emission zone in terms of size, in terms of rules. So it's basically a scenario design activity that allows us to extract some results on how different scenarios perform. However, if this was applied in reality, then I would expect that there would be operationalization issues that should kind of be taken care of from, I imagine, different operators and the municipality itself. But I don't know about the rest of the cases on public roads. Maybe this is something that applies more on operationalized evaluations.
Perhaps the project more, Charlotte or Peter, you can have a word on that, the enforcement problems.
Yes, I do. Yeah, thank you for the question. It's something we've looked at, especially in the work package that I was looking at on governance and regulatory frameworks. Simon Morgan from UK Computing has been reporting on this. The 2 points to this. The first one is that one of the key challenges for cities is where the police forces are located. And this is something that we looked into the MORE project in order to understand, what was the previous relationship existing between city authorities and local police forces. In the case there are no local police forces, which was the case in some of the countries that we looked at. How did it work together with the national police? And in a number of cases, this isn't very effective. This is, just to put it broadly speaking, the crash conclusion we came to. That's one point. The second thing is that as part of the co-construction system that we put in place, and especially the engagement tools, we actually brought around the table representatives from those police forces in order to work together with the city authorities in understanding the needs of the local authorities and working together with them as part of enforcement. And this was, in almost all the cases, really, one of the first times that those stakeholders had been speaking together, working together around a table about this specific issue of enforcing parking rules, but also working together on how enforcing road space reallocation roads. So, again, I don't want to overemphasize, what has been already said by Ralph before, but I think this takes time. It's also about learning and bringing around the same table some stakeholders that are not necessarily used to speaking together, because those spaces don't exist, because there is no previous institutional framework for that, or just because some of those actors just work at different levels with some institutional discrepancies between the way it functions. The third point, I think, is about the specific case of the UK, but I think Peter would like to report on that.
Thank you. Yes, briefly, we found that while enforcement was left to the police, it wasn't a high priority. And so legislation has changed so that local authorities can do enforcing of parking and many moving traffic regulations now. And as a result of that, they put that out to the private sector, and companies bid to actually do the enforcement. So that's their day job, as it were. So the enforcement is much more thorough. There have been some arguments that the private companies have almost put motorists in situations where they didn't realise they couldn't park there. But I mean, I think that's been sorted out. It's a very well organised industry now. And it also has the advantages. It's one removed politically. If it's the local authority directly doing the enforcement, there's more pressure. Whereas when it's gone out to a third party, it's done more thoroughly and it takes off some of the political pressure.
Ralph, do you want to add something from Sunrise?
Thank you. Just a quick observation, not a solution of any sorts, but I think it's important to differentiate when you introduce a new rule. zero emission zone or whatever, you kind of introduce the rule, you communicate the enforcement mechanism and so forth. That's a challenge, but that's completely different from when you have actually old rules, but they were ignored for decades, and then you come in and you want to enforce it. It's a completely different situation. As I said, I don't have a solution to that. But I think we need to differentiate in the way we think about these different kinds of animals.
Okay, thank you very much. Any further question, please?
I would like to make a comment on this. There seems to be a problem between market regulations and enforcement. For example, when you give it to third parties, they actually manage it like the way a central bank manages the process. They make sure that you don't always get a ticket. Because if you were to always get a ticket, you will stop generating revenues for them. So the whole point about parking penalties or speed penalties or road access penalties, etc., are about selective enforcement to make sure that the city is somewhat choked by definition. Because if you were to enforce them properly, the behavior would change. If I knew that every time I park in the wrong place, I'm going to get a ticket, I would actually stop parking there. But if I know that there's a chance that I'm not going to get a ticket, I will not park. It's that simple. So third parties know this process really well. So they make sure that there is selective enforcement to kind of keep the demand and supply in balance, the way monetary policy works, let's say.
Can I come back on that briefly, if I may? That used to, I mean, in the UK, the early contracts were based on things like how much revenue brought in, but that's changed now because of that effect. And in fact, what happens now is that the enforcement is done, obviously, to a level at which it's not becoming very, it more or less pays for itself, but the idea is not so much to maximise revenue in that sense. But what it means is that motorists, if they need to come in, are more likely to use existing parking spaces. And essentially, local authorities now set this parking charges so that on average 10% of the spaces will be empty, so people don't have to cruise for too long. So the effect of the better enforcement actually is to raise the legal parking prices because more people are competing for spaces. So there's less money potentially from fine, but more money for legitimate parking. But it depends on local authority.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? If not, I would like to raise one question for the question is the limitation that we have in the cities is the urban space. So some of you comment on that, and then you can decide, I mean, local authorities or users can decide the use of this limited urban space. According to the results from your projects, particularly, for example, the use of dedication space for cycling, for example, the handshake project, could you explain, is there any kind of protest or, I mean, competition in using this space that you dedicate, for example, cycle lanes or parking, cycling, all these things that in some places, in some cities, creates a problem because this urban space is also demanding for other activities like pedestrian or terrace or sports or things like that.
Yes, I mean, so of course we had this kind of conflict in our cities, especially in what we call the future cycling capitals, and also in the terms of enforcement, what we observe, for example, in terms of public space management and reallocation of this space for cycling, that is hardest in the city where it doesn't have a strong enforcement mechanism. And what we observe in Bordeaux, for example, then they had an enforcement mechanism similar to the London one, right? I think it was an example from London that was shared from a public and private authorities, when the public authority was in charge of manage the public space and the parking fees, specialists, they realized the benefit of do a proper enforcement of that and invest this benefit in other mobility strategies. So what we do in Handshake is to involve as much political department and citizens organization to co-create, as other projects did, the cycling strategies and the vision of the management of the public space. This is what we found the most effective tools to overcome this kind of conflict and, of course, to communicate properly to the citizens the change and the old rules.
Okay, thank you. Charlotte, you want to add something on that? Okay, Teresa. Oh, Teresa first, okay.
Thank you. Now I would like to illustrate how Sprout addresses the case of the space with a couple of examples. One is one of the use cases implemented in Budapest, and well, they decided to close one section of the street in order to create an area for restricting the general traffic in favor of the most other means of transport, cycling, pedestrians, and personal mobility. And this case relates a little bit with the case in Sunrise in Bremen, because they also decided to close 40 parking spaces, and this created lots of noise, obviously, in the neighborhood. The citizens, the media blamed the authorities of the district in Budapest. It was needed minor modifications to the pilot, some months of implementation, and many public hearings between the stakeholders and the public authorities. And finally, it seems that it has been accepted, and the authorities want to expand this restricted area and create a superblock. We will see what happens. What we know is that the testing time for Sprout has ended, and they have not come back to the previous situation. Yeah. They are still with this area closed to the general traffic. And another example that is quite different is one of the use cases in Tel Aviv. It's different because it's not about banning, it's purely about sharing. In Tel Aviv, there are public works in order to introduce the light rail or light train. And one of the use cases, the scope in Sprout, was to reallocate the public space in order to balance the capacity, safety, and livability. And in the future, one of the streets that we studied in Tel Aviv will have rail tracks, one car lane, another bus lane, benches, trees, bus stops, sidewalks, a mess, as we all know in our cities and from other different projects. And there is a vivid discussion there regarding there are two parties, pedestrians versus cyclists, with different, they have different opinions about different issues on the design of the street, and they have conflicts. How we address this in Sprout? Through methodology, House of Quality in this case. I'm sure that in the audience many people will know this methodology, and also other speakers are much better than me. But the idea behind is to really understand which are the different stakeholder needs and their perception. What they understand is safe. How they identify attractiveness, okay? So they created different stakeholder groups, but not only cyclists and pedestrians, also segmenting them, old people, mothers with kids, young people, and so on. And this methodology was proved to be quite useful in order to use user needs into policy making.
Okay, thank you. Charlotte, you want to add something?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I think street space contestation is something that was very central in the MORE project. I have to say that when we came up with this idea of street space contestation, having a proper work done on this, there was a lot of disbelief among our partners saying, you know, contestation, conflict, this is a very bad word. We should be talking about co-construction, we should be talking about how to find solutions. But in a sense, contestation and conflict is not something that is systematically blocking the way through which cities can function over time. In the case of MORE, a lot of the contestation and the conflicts had to do with different users' needs being taken into account in the way street space was being relocated, or some groups that were not able to organize themselves, to make themselves heard, not being sufficiently heard. So the risk, if you only focus on a user's need approach in your governance of street space relocation, is that you will mainly listen to those groups that have access to the administration, to the decision-making systems, those that have lobbying capacities, and misheard some of those. So, for example, cyclists and car drivers, for different reasons, had a lot of access to the governance systems, whereas pedestrians, or some of the groups that Ralph mentioned before, children, elderly people, people with reduced mobility, we're talking about different types of groups, were less organized in their ability to actually shape and challenge the way through which the city was being addressed. So as part of MORE, what we did was to think not in terms of users' needs, but to think in terms of a more holistic approach to street space in order for city authorities to draw on all the different interests that are being represented at the level of a neighborhood. So if you include all those different groups in the discussion and the co-construction system, this was a way for us to make sure that there was some representation possible for these different groups, but also for city authorities to find new allies in their own battles that they had to lead against transport authorities or against the national government in order to impose a different approach to street space management. And what's one of the key findings that we have for the work we did as part of MORE, together with my colleague Jenny MacArthur from UCL, is that we've find that city authorities worked more and more with NGOs, with representatives from different of those users groups in order to co-develop some strategies, one of them being tactical urbanism, which we've spoken quite a lot as part of the COVID. And this is something that has been going long enough in cities. And actually they've developed this on an institutional level in order to challenge their member states. And this at times even went into legal battles in order to challenge the national state, in order to impose and enforce some of the decisions that had been made in terms of the legal battle. So I think this word contestation, I would plead, but this is my political scientist background, to not see this necessarily as a bad thing, but to put it back in the picture and see how it is being used, developed, and how in some cases it can support also the redefinition of interest organization at the local level and reshape the way through which entrenched interests have been for a long time able to co-develop some of the measures while neglecting other needs.
May I suggest enlarging this consideration by considering the access or the problem of accessing a new solution, innovative solution based on digital tools? I mean, all people, disability. Did you check any of these problems in your projects? Okay, Teresa, perhaps.
Well, in our case, we addressed the inclusivity of those groups in some of the use cases. One of the use cases, for instance, in the city of Padua about autonomous bots for passengers and freight, we developed, the project developed an app, and it was tested with elderly groups of elderly people and so on in order to improve it. It's true that the Sprout doesn't go directly into this, and something that we are doing now is that we are in cooperation with another European project that I think it has been presented this morning, which is Indimo. It's about inclusivity and accessibility in digital transport systems. We have found many synergies between both projects, and we are cooperating. One of the things that they have done is to develop a service evaluation tool assesses how much inclusive and accessible is a service and a digital solution, and we will try that our cities test their policy tool and include it, of course, in the toolbox. So, yeah.
Okay, we have another. Okay, Peter, you want to comment on that?
Just very briefly on that, yes. I mean, we're talking about space and contested space, but the other dimension is time. And one way to get around contested space is to vary its use at different times of day. So classically, peak period, bus lane may be being available for loading off-peak, but we can be much more sophisticated than that. And also, as we know more about how streets operate from day to day, we can potentially flex the allocation of space more dynamically in time to get more out. So by adding the time dimension, we get a bit more playroom, if you like.
Good point. And then Bremen again?
Yeah, me again. When we look around here in Brussels or in German cities, we see that we have thousands of bollards of physical obstacles to enforce behavior. And the question is, we had yesterday CCAM presentations, a lot of technical devices were presented for, I don't know, time horizon of 2040 or something. But we were missing something geo-referenced that we have in these little e-scooters, for instance, but don't have them in cars, that you cannot leave these cars behind, as you cannot leave an e-scooter behind in these no parking zones. So the question is, more to the European Commission than to the projects here, when can we expect something like ESA for driving, that we have some geo-reference tool or some recognition of street signs that prevent people from leaving the cars behind on sidewalks, on cycle paths, and wherever it's consuming space where it shouldn't do. So when can we expect this? Thank you.
Okay, perhaps Thiago, your
very easy question,
rebound effect.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we all know that the sharing of car data, it's one of the most sensitive topics, right? And then, of course, you know, there are a lot of, the Commission has been organized a lot of working groups which are working together in trying to solve this and trying to see how these data can be shared in a way that can help also the traffic management. Of course, you know, there's a revision of the ITS directive and also of the regulation dealing with the traffic management, and also includes the car data. And of course, in these new directives and regulations, we are aiming to really have this more access, at least for the data that's really important, that can also help, you know, cities to manage the traffic. But of course, as you know, there are also business cases behind it, and there's a lot of strong support and the use of this car data for several, of course, say solutions that they have in the market. So, but of course, we are strongly working on that, and we hope that in the next years things at least will change.
Peter, yeah.
Just a quick comment, thank you. Yes, I mean, bollards are very unsightly, etc. And as part of improving public realm and so on, there's been pressure to take out bollards and partly to rely on better enforcement. What's happened in the last few years that's turned that completely on its head in many UK cities, though, is terrorism and the concern about terrorist attacks. So now around our major railway state, we have these huge bollards that will withstand a very large vehicle, etc. And so now the urban designers are having to be imaginative to try and put in seating and stuff instead that actually adds to the public realm, but is strong enough to resist a vehicle. So just as we thought we were getting rid of bollards, this other thing came in and it's raised it again. Thank you.
Okay, is there any further question for the audience? If not, I would like to raise a comment on that, because I read in some documents that you reduce the number of cars in cities, in the streets, you reduce the number of accidents, so safety is improving. But at the same time, dedicated more space to other activities, as you say, Peter, probably there appear new security problems. So you change safety by security problems. You are changing the problem And do you notice on this project any of these, Peter said, not only terrorism, but also robbers or all kind of things people behaving badly or?
Well, we have this kind of problem in our cycling capital as Copenhagen and Amsterdam. Then is arising a new safety problem with electric mopeds, for example, and high-speed bikes, because of course they create a safety problem, especially with old people and people then have a different mobility ability. So it is an emerging issue in these kind of cities where they have a high cycling rates, and they are facing. They are trying to address this issue with different solutions. For example, create different cycling paths for high-speed bikes and for old or young people then go by bike in a slower than adults of other users.
And Ralph, did you find this problem in your co-creation sessions with all the actors? The limitation in terms of safety, security, and the combination of different actions in the same space.
What comes to mind is the case of Malmö in Sweden, where there's actually a nice park, which is a shortcut to major destinations from one residential area towards the city center. And people were afraid of using this because people misused it as a shortcut by car. There was drug dealing going on. There was a socially really problematic area, drug dealing, murders even. So there was clearly a connection between security and safety, and then just the convenience of using active modes. Yes, that is in some cases certainly something to look at.
Okay, Peter and Charlotte, that you would.
Yes, I think there are two places, I would say, in more where we saw there's a contradiction sometimes taking place. The first one was in terms of the policy agenda at the city level, with some contradictions in what were the priorities that were to be addressed as part of mobility issues. One key example that we had was, for example, whether the Vision Zero strategy in some cities would prevent the development of cycling or walking or other facilities and developing micro-shared mobility. In order to put safety as being the guiding principle through which mobility and road space allocation would be met. So this could be one example where we had different priorities, and this would prevent some of the demands stemming from some users groups, in this case cycling more specifically. Then there is a second aspect that was very much at the center of our work is what was done by Technische Universität Dresden and our colleague Regine Gericke in looking at what were the different design guiding principles that existed, and by revising them, by reviewing them, by highlighting where there were some blind spots, what needed to be further developed in order to bring those different guiding principles together, designs options for cyclists, designs options for pedestrians, design options for all different kinds of users, and by putting them together and making them part of the street redesign process. This was an opportunity actually to have a more holistic approach to how those design tools could function. But we needed to go through this first aspect and to look at what existed on the ground in those cities.
Okay, final comment, Peter?
Just to follow up on Charlotte's point, actually, the problem at the moment with things like e-scooters is that cities are being reactive. Somebody comes along, develops something, and the city thinks, my God, how are we going to handle this? And we're always on the back foot. And one of the recommendations in More is that we should be proactive rather than reactive. By which I mean is we look in our streets and we define different zones within the street. Let's, for simplicity, call them a footway zone, a micro-mobility zone as a general traffic zone. And for each of those zones, define a permitted performance envelope. So if you're going to go on the footway, you can't go more than, I don't know, 8 kilometers per hour or something, you can't be more than a certain size. Or similarly, if you go in the micro-mobility lane, you can't be more than a certain size or a certain weight. So in that case, if we actually got agreement within cities on the accepted performance envelopes for different zones, then if a new developer came along with a new idea, if they wanted to get it implemented, they'd know they'd have to fit one of those performance zones. And then it makes the thing more regulated, and also means from a city's point of view, they know what they're designing for, because at the moment, you know, cargo bikes are becoming bigger and bigger, and, you know, some of them are almost the size of vans, and they don't fit in cycle lanes and so on. And of course, this makes it very difficult to keep retrofitting the city. So I think if we're on the front foot and said, right, these are the size or weight limits, etc., and that's what we're designing for, I think it would make us easier, and then the initiative of the developers can be to produce something that meets our requirements rather than something that we have to redesign the city for.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to close this discussion. Well, there are many ideas, but I probably want to highlight 3 or 4 statements as has been done along this presentation and discussion. One is the needs for collaboration among the different actors. So it's a mixed use, but also a mixed responsibility. The urban space, the time of using this space, and also the enforcement. So that means that we need support tools to incorporate all the opinions, all the discussion, and to create a new scenario, probably in the long term, in the medium term. And for that end, we need simulation tools that the ones have been proposed in the 4 projects. So thank you very much all the speakers and all the questions. And I give the floor back to Tiago as a chairman of this session.
Thanks to the speakers for this amazing presentation, and also for you to stay with us and also be interested. I just wanted to highlight one thing, that of course the research has been done in so many aspects, and there's still some gaps. So there are 2 calls that are actually open now for Horizon Europe, and those interested should really look at those. One is looking into urban planning and design for just, sustainable, resilient, and climate neutral cities. This has a deadline, 26th of April. And then the other one with the deadline in September is like designing inclusive, safe, affordable, and sustainable urban mobility. So these 2 are really related. They can be really the next steps, looking how this research can continue. And now we should enjoy lunch, and in the afternoon we're going to have here in the session about introducing connected automated mobility in real traffic conditions, which I think is one of the question that everybody wants to hear. Also, not only about the technology, which was already mentioned that yesterday it has been quite developed, but how this can be integrated. And thank you very much.
Don't forget the big messages. I'll place them on the table.
Can I take one big message? Sure.